good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Sylla. There was a time not so long ago when Sri Lanka was a significant player on the world stage. Hard to believe? Well, let me go back to 1955, which many of our viewers will remember, was when the Bandung Conference was formed, and it was in fact the precursor to the non-aligned movement, and Sri Lanka was one of the 5 nations which actually organized the Bandung Conference, and the conference itself had 29 nations who accounted for 54% of the world's population at the time. And of course the other organizing nations at the time were India, Pakistan, Myanmar and Indonesia. And in fact the very idea for the Bandung Conference was mooted a year before at the Colombo Powers Conference of 1954. So Sri Lanka was very much on the world stage back then. This year the celebration was 70 years after Bandung, and we had a 2-day event which was at the BCIS, the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies, which went off very successfully. And I happen to have 2 guests, 2 experts from that particular conference, which was at the BCIS. Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla from Senegal, who is a development economist. Welcome, Dr. Ndongo.
Thanks for having me.
And we have also Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, who is the Global Director of Research and Policy at IDEAS, which is the International Development Economics Associates. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
All right, good to have you all here. First of all, how was the conference? Was it successful? I know you had 2 days of intense discussions and presentations, and many of the region's intelligentsia, people involved in foreign relations, finance, international matters of that sort, they were there. So, Professor, what can you tell us about?
Well, I mean, the first is, the discussions were really vibrant and lively. People were very engaged. The other thing which was very interesting for us and very reassuring, where there were a lot of young people in the audience, which matters because many of them weren't even born when Bandung took place, and we were in search of the Bandung spirit. So it was nice to have them there. And of course, we were fortunate that we had people from different less developed countries, the global majority countries from across the world, Latin America, Africa, and India. I would say that it exceeded our expectations.
Excellent, excellent. And Dr. Ndongo, would you concur with that? And you have come a long way. You're from Senegal, which is in West Africa.
From Senegal to here for the first time, and I was pleased to discover the country, Sri Lanka, and also to reconnect with that past history, because as you said in your introduction, Sri Lanka played a leading role, to the Bandung process. So we were happy to have people coming from all of the now what is called Global South. Before we used to talk about the Third World. And it was, as Professor Chandrasekhar said, very interesting debates, very interesting presentations, and also a moment to try to revive the Third World spirit of solidarity and how we could, revive South-South solidarity.
Excellent. And to give our viewers a little bit more of an introduction on our 2 guests, Dr. Ndongo is a development economist. His research focuses on fair trade, labor markets in developing countries, social movements, democratic theory, and economic and monetary sovereignty. all of which are very interesting for Sri Lanka at this point in time, because we are grappling with many issues in those areas. And of course, we have Professor Chandrasekhar, who is the Global Director of Research and Policy at the International Development Economics Associates, IDEAS. He is also a Senior Research Fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in the USA. Professor Chandrasekhar he was engaged in teaching and research at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at India's Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi for more than 30 years. He is the author of numerous books, academic journals, and served as an advisor to various multilateral organizations as well as public departments in India. So, gentlemen, delighted to have both of you here. Now, Dr. Nango, can I ask you to describe the world as it was in 1955, which many of especially the Gen Z and millennials and so on can't even fathom what it was like. You had the Western powers on one side. This was the Cold War, and then you had the Soviet bloc, and here were these countries like Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, and certain Middle Eastern and African countries, which wanted nothing to do with that rivalry, and they needed to form their own bloc. Could you tell us about this whole? It was a different world back then.
Indeed, and when we talk about Bandung, we have generally two words: moment and spirit. The moment was a moment of contestation by the colonial people, the colonized people, contestation of the world economy, but also the world political order, because Latin America got its independence in the 19th century, most of the countries in Latin America. But for Asia, it was mostly during the 20th century, and for Africa, most of African countries after the Bandung Conference. So during the moment of the Bandung Conference, let's say after World War II, we were going towards this period of Cold War between, the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc. And you had the colonial people, from Asia, from Africa, saying that we want to have our own autonomy, and we would like to gain our sovereignty, political sovereignty, and also create a new world that will acknowledge us and that will also serve the economic needs of our people. So Bandung was this moment. It was a moment of contestation, but also we had very charismatic leaders at that same time. They could have various, political ideologies, etc., but they were committed, to change, to reform, and also to national liberation. So that was the moment, and the spirit also was a spirit of solidarity between countries. Across what was called the Third World, in Africa, in Asia, but also with Latin America.
Interesting. And Professor Chandrasekhar, now we speak of a time when the colonial powers their empires were receding, and you had all these new nations gaining their independence in Asia and Africa. So there was a momentum of anti-colonialism, of breaking away, and also of solidarity among these new nations, wouldn't you say?
Yes, that was a period of decolonization, particularly in Africa and Asia. Not that all countries came out of colonial dominance by the time Bandung took place, but there were major advances. There was a revolution in China. India had won independence. There was Egypt. There were many countries which actually. So there was a wave of decolonization which had begun, and it was very clear that the older imperial powers were in decline. But we shouldn't forget the fact that was also the period where the new hegemon, which was the United States, had actually established and consolidated its position. It had defeated Japan and Germany in the Second World War. But it was not a country which, unlike the earlier imperial powers, could, in the context of decolonization, the emergence of independent states, it could not be a country which actually had territorial control over colonies. That period was over. So, in fact, one of the interesting things about Bandung, including in the inaugural speech which was given by Sukarno, who hosted the conference in Indonesia.
The president of Indonesia.
Yeah, that's right. So, he actually said that, listen, I mean, first, of course, the declaration said that colonialism is evil and it should be got rid of in all of its manifestations. And I think it was important that it referred to all of its manifestations. And it was made clear in this inaugural speech, in which he said that don't think colonialism is dead, because we shouldn't treat it only in its older iconic form, that it would now come in modern dress to control assets, to control ideas, thinking. That would be the effect of what he said, a small alien community which would still be within our nations. And you need to fight back. So it was also a declaration that, having won political independence, these countries wanted to come together and really create an environment in which they can shore up that political independence by winning themselves economic freedom, because they had long years of experience of domination in an unequal world order. So that's why it led up to the new, demand for the new international economic order, to NAM and so on. It did many things. It was a precursor to many things, but it was basically a reflection of the recognition that colonialism, though dead in its old form, was now going to try and reassert itself, and sometimes very brutally, as we know, in terms of the assassinations which took place, the massacre which took place in Indonesia a few years after Bandung was held. So I think, we are in a brutal world today as well, and therefore we should actually recognize that there was a spirit which went just beyond celebrating the end of the old kind of colonialism.
Now, Professor, you spoke of some of these giants among the leaders of what we now call the developing world. Or it was NAM or Bandung, and you mentioned President Sukarno of Indonesia. But could you mention some of the other leaders? I think Nehru.
Of course, there was Jawaharlal Nehru. There was Nasser from Egypt. There was Nkrumah, of course, but he didn't turn up at the Bandung. But he was a great supporter of it. He had other reasons why he couldn't come. So yes, there were a range of leaders. There was Nyerere, who subsequently became very important in the African context as a leader of an effort at national liberation in some sense. So yes, they all came out of an environment in which there was, in many of these countries, an all-in unity against imperialism. So the point was how they're going to resolve. It was very clear that they had resolved the relationship between the people and the state under colonialism. But given the fact that it was an all-in unity, which included within very divided societies, they needed to think about the way in which they were going to resolve the relationship between the people and the state after they won their independence. And that's where perhaps some of the problems began.
Right. And some of these giants among leaders, they were so strong and so prominent that they could stand up to the imperial powers, couldn't they? They could just, they could in a speech tell the US or UK or the Soviet Union what's what, and read the riot act.
I'm sure Ndongo would come in on Africa on this in particular, but we must realize that they were giants in multiple senses. They were, of course, intellectual giants, and they had actually thought through what it meant to try and lead their countries in the direction that they promised to lead it. They were also giants because they had social sanction. It was a meeting of leaders, but it had the support of the populations of these countries, which gave them the sanction and therefore the strength to be able to stand up. And of course, some of them, carried this further. I think it was Krishna Menon, who was, defense minister in India, who basically, referring to some comment about the Indian elite or something, said, The problem with the English is that they picked up their English. I learnt my English, you know. So, you know.
Interesting indeed. Dr. Nonko, what about the African context? Now, African nations generally got their independence from colonial powers a little later, perhaps 50s, 60s, and even further. What was the context here?
Well, the context was this Bandung moment because, as Professor Chandrasekhar said, we had, I mean, Africa and Asia, charismatic leaders, etc. But there had been also important victories against imperialism. For example, the Indochina War, was won, against the French, for example, just before the Bandung Conference. So that strengthened somehow, the strength of, African nations, African peoples. And this started also after World War II because most of, the troops, some of the troops came from Africa and they were there fighting, because they had, you had this kind of, racial, subordination saying that you are not human, etc. You are colonized people. And they were on the battlefields, with Europeans, and sometimes, they made, really acts of bravo to some extent. And so all of this, also contributed to awaken, their conscientiousness and to say that we have to assert our rights. And when, during this period, you could see important victories against imperialism in one part of the world, this had also consequences in other parts of the world. For example, when Vietnam defeated, the French, French army at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, 2 years later, the French was obliged to give universal suffrage to their colonies because they feared a war of liberation, because another war of liberation was being waged, against Algeria. And now imagine you have at least 12, colonies or 14 colonies. You have to wage a war of liberation. The French could not, handle that. That's why they said we have to give them political rights and self-autonomy, etc., on economic matters, etc. So that means at that time there was a solidarity in the struggles. And indeed, the first country to become independent in sub-Saharan Africa was Ghana, 1957. And after that, you had Guinea in 1958. And from the 1960s, you have, all this wave of, independencies. And the last ones to get their independence were the Portuguese colonies, because Portugal has been a very backward country. But at the same time, it was also interesting because they were ruled by a fascist government. And, the victories on the ground, to some extent, discouraged, even the military who were there. And at one point, it was young officers, progressive, who said, we have to remove this, fascist government. So that means that there is a unity of struggles. And that has been really important during this whole period, let's say, from Bandung to the, 1980s.
Interesting indeed. We need to take a short commercial break. I am in conversation with Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar and Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla, who are here in Sri Lanka to celebrate 70 years after the Bandung Conference. Don't go away, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar and Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla, who are here for the celebration of 70 years after the Bandung Conference, where Sri Lanka played a key role in gathering together the nations which had just received independence. Now, Professor, let me ask you or follow on from a point that you made, where the leaders of that era warned that colonialism was not dead back then in 1955, and they foresaw that colonialism would metamorphosize, would take on a different form, and would in fact continue to try to rule the world. Can you put that in today's context, 70 years down the road, how it has changed but stayed the same?
Yeah, so if I may sort of be quick on that one. So let's say there are three kinds of transitions which we have seen. If you take the period immediately around Bandung and immediately after Bandung, the first kind of transition was of countries which decided to adopt mixed economies, where the private sector played a significant role in investment and other decision making. But the government had a significant role, but they wanted to diversify their economies away from the old kind of international division of labor, where they were largely producers of primary products in traditional manufactures, and had to import their machinery and a whole host of other goods. And the terms of trade or the terms of exchange in international trade was something which moved against them. And therefore, this was not a way in which they could actually try to accelerate the rate of growth, and in some sense raise per capita incomes over a period of time with productivity increases. So there was a whole idea that you needed to diversify, and at that point of time the centrality of industry was something which most of them sort of based their development strategies on. And what we did have in most of these countries, which actually then tried to in some sense de-link themselves, not completely, but let's say insulate themselves to a degree from both global markets, which they saw as being entities which did not give them the benefits of development during the colonial era, and from foreign capital, which they wanted to keep at bay, which they thought was an instrument for the extraction and redistribution of surplus from the south or the global majority to the north. So there was one set of countries which did that, and by the time we got to the 70s, for reasons which of course I don't want to go into here just now because it gets deep, but we know that most of these countries, import substitution, so long as you were trying to fill a market which you had protected from imports, and you fill that market, you saw growth. But that was a once for all growth, because that was a once for all market. If you wanted to grow further, you had to have the market itself expanding over a period of time, and for various reasons they didn't manage, and therefore we began to see a flagging of growth. And they then decided to embrace what we term neoliberalism in a broad sense, that they decided that no more domestic market, no more too much state. We go for the market, we go for external markets, we try to export, we bring in foreign capital, and so on. And today we are seeing the consequences of deep vulnerability, a debt crisis in many of these countries, etc. So that's one transition. The second transition we saw were in countries, where a set of countries, because of their special position vis-a-vis the United States, in particular South Korea and Taiwan. And South Korea came out of colonialism in some sense because of American occupation, which threw out the Japanese, and along with that Japanese capital and Japanese landlordism left, creating a space in which virtually the South Korean state, which was created by the United States in some sense, or installed by the United States, created its own classes, created its own capitalist class, as it were. But because of that and the special relationship, they were able right from very early in their development strategies, from 1961 onwards, to move directly into trying to grow on the basis of world markets. Now, they were not a periphery in global capitalism. They were a semi-core of core capitalism because of their special relationship with the United States, and they turned out to be successful. But you can't say they are models in all senses, because we can't replicate in all of these countries that history. And finally, there was a third transition, and that transition came out of the revolutions in China and Vietnam subsequently. And those were ones which went on a socialist trajectory with central planning for a considerable period of time, were successful in the sense of being able to bring most of their population into the actual working force, but were not successful in terms of being able to raise productivity fast enough. And therefore they too, after long years, in the case of China after 1978, even later Doi Moi in Vietnam and so on, but perhaps because of the resilience and the strengths that they got out of that period of central planning, in which the state played a role and contributed in terms of educating its population, improving human capital, and of course creating a public sector which was quite substantial. They also proved very successful in terms of exporters. But the point is, this is not a trajectory which is open for countries today. Now Vietnam is rushing. Every country fighting with each other for a share in US and European markets is rushing to Washington to appease Mr. Trump. So perhaps we have to go back and think that, oh, maybe we weren't all that successful after the Second World War in those strategies, but we need a version of that strategy, because these so-called success cases grew on the basis of a world economy which was very different, and that world economy has changed. So in some sense, it's a very different moment, as you mentioned, but it actually poses a kind of challenge where it's asking countries to devise strategies, not just by themselves, but in solidarity and together, where they can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and not rely on world markets and foreign capital.
So, Dr. Enongo, following on from what Professor said, back in 1955, and then with the NAM, the non-aligned movement as well, you had that sense of solidarity among the global South, which accounted for more than half the world's population, or even greater than that, and most of the world's nations as well, South America, Africa, Asia, and so on. But today we don't see that solidarity among the nations of the global South. We see it in pockets, but in regions. But there is no global movement. NAM itself seems to have died after the Cold War ended, and so there is no great movement like that, is there?
Well, it depends, because as you said, there have been attempts at uniting the third world, as it was called at that time, because after Bandung we had the non-aligned movement, and after we had the new international economic order, etc., and before also the creation of the United Nations Conference on Development, and they tried to have a common position on structural economic issues at the global level. They tried to have that, but they would be sabotaged by the West. The West would say, oh, we could not, afford to meet your demands. For example, this country was saying, we would like to have a better market access, for example, because there's a form of discrimination to accessing your markets because of your tariffs and so on. We would like to have better control of our resources, have better prices to improve our terms of trade, these kind of things. We would like to have technology transfers, etc., and also address the debt issue, these kind of things. So there were common positions. But the US, for example, they would say, we are not interested. And that was the position of, the Reagan administration, and even before that, you see. So when we had this global debt crisis, the reaction has been to say, oh, we are, for the countries described by Professor Chandrasekhar, the first transition, all of these countries in the global South, I mean Latin America and Africa specifically, they were crushed economically through, structural adjustment plans to some extent. And some of the progressive governments you would have, they would also accept the reality. That means you have to implement austerity policies, because if you don't implement austerity policies, maybe you will not have access to loans from the IMF and the World Bank. You will not be able to pay your salaries, these kind of things. And so to some extent, I think this created a form of fragmentation between what used to be the third world. And now we are seeing attempts at creating a form of resistance against imperialism as it is today. We could think, for example, of the BRICS. The BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's a kind of ambiguous project, but still there is potential in it, because in these countries they see that they have some interest in delinking from the current imperialist order to some extent. And this can create and is creating space for the other countries, from the global South, etc. But there are also, some shortcomings, because some member countries of the BRICS are not themselves intrinsically following progressive policies. For example, they have not clearly dealt with neoliberalism. That's not the case of China, but in the case of China, as Prof. Chandru said, in fact, maybe there is a need to reinvent its economic model to go from a phase where, it was relying on strong, state investment and strong, external surplus, is in a way that you have to rely on, enlarging domestic markets and even, incurring, trade deficits against, the other partners, in the global south. So I think there are, different trends now, but definitely we are going towards what is called a multipolar world, because the Western hegemony, as it used to function, could no longer, maintain itself. But now we could have different scenarios. But for the global south, I think it's important to unite in order to give a progressive direction to the trends we are witnessing.
Now, Dr. Ndongo, you mentioned the financial problems of these nations. And today we see so many nations which are basically running to the IMF. You mentioned that as well. Basically, now if you take Sri Lanka as a case study, we were doing fairly well. We had our development banks in the 1990s, so development was happening. But then we seem to take on the wrong financial models and follow those models, and we ended up in bankruptcy. And today, the present government of Sri Lanka is trying to set up a development bank to drive the economy and the growth, which is ironic, because I remember a time 30 years ago when we had development banks which drove the economy, and we had strong growth, and then of course those were converted into commercial banks, and those low interest loans which entrepreneurs could tap suddenly didn't exist. So what's the financial model here when it comes to development banks and a country's development?
I think there are two aspects. There are aspects, at the global level, the way the international monetary and financial system works. Because what you described about Sri Lanka, we could have, the same discussion for many countries across the world. And my country, for example, Senegal. But the thing is, this international financial system creates a debt crisis. So sometimes people are tempted to say that, oh, you have, mismanagement, corruption, etc. In some cases, you could have that, but this is an aggravating factor. But that's not the structural factor that explains debt crisis, because we are in a very, dysfunctional international finance system, which requires these countries, all of these countries, which have to grow to develop themselves, to acquire foreign exchange, generally US dollar. And so that means these countries are dependent, on the decision taken by the US economy and so on. So this system is not good at all, because it creates problems for countries that are in deficit position, that generally run trade deficits, current account deficits, etc. And these countries are generally at the mercy of the IMF. And when you are at the mercy of the IMF could come and impose, very harsh decisions. For example, there has been a report from the World Bank about the structural assessment program in my country, Senegal. And one thing the report says that the area which was the most successful were, the liquidation and the privatization of the Senegalese banking sector. And they say it like that because we used to have state banks, etc., development banks, but all of that, was, privatized for the benefit, of foreign capital. Now, if you look at the statistics, for example, in my country, you would see that more than 90% of banking assets are controlled by foreign banks. You see, when you compare that, for example, with the UK, they have a city. The foreign assets controlled by foreigners, should be less than 20%, and it's very open. So this is another form of colonialism, but this is implemented through structural adjustment policies. But now, if you want to have some autonomy, in your economic policies, you need to have some state instruments. That's why you need, development banks, other forms of state banks, etc. That's really important, because you could not do everything through state budget. You should have also other instruments.
Dr. Chandrasekhar, Professor Chandrasekhar, beg your pardon. Do we all in the global south need to rethink our financial systems? Because we followed what basically the global financial systems have dictated to us, and here we are with I mean, it's like a tunnel, and we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Do we need to, as a group of nations, perhaps sit down and figure out what the world's financial systems need to actually be, rather than this profit-oriented situation which the global financial giants now control?
Yeah, let me put, okay, 2 or 3 aspects. Aspect number 1, okay, normally what do people think? That financial system consists of a bunch of institutions which are intermediaries. So let's say they take depositors' money and provide credit to those who wanted, credit, etc. Or they see it as institutions which constitute the core of the settlement system. I mean, you and I don't carry bags of notes if you want to go and buy something expensive. There are different ways in which you pay that goes through the banking system and gets settled. But besides that, what actually has been true in what to use a broad term, all late industrializers, starting with Germany, or even before that, even in France, Credit Mobilier in France, is that you also wanted the financial system, because you're a late industrializer, which didn't have, a private sector which had accumulated large amounts of capital, which it was willing to put into areas which give you social benefits, but not necessarily very high profits, but some profits, of course. That you realize that you could not rely only on that. So you needed a financial structure which can also serve as a development instrumentality. And there are some risks associated with building a financial structure like that, and therefore you need to have a protective ring-fencing mechanism to protect these institutions, okay? And so in fact, if you go to Germany, it was actually the commercial banks which were responsible for building the highways, for building the railroads, for building cities, financing cities, etc. And always the central bank, the Reichsbank, would in some sense provide them an implicit guarantee that if at all, because of you doing these things which are important from the point of view of the economy and society as a whole, puts you in some liquidity problem, that your money is locked up and your depositors want money, let us say, put crudely, then you can always come to me and I will give you liquidity, because I'm going to use my right of note issue to create the money to give to you to protect the role that you play. Now, when it came to developing countries, it was very difficult because, Western banking was an implant on these countries. They had their old informal and other kinds of, so it being an implant, you actually at independence in many of these countries, you actually had a very weak banking system. Sometimes banks which were small, which didn't even have many branches and so on. So you couldn't put on them the same burden that let's say Germany put, or the Reichsbank put on commercial banks in Germany. So you basically said that we need specialized institutions which have specialized access to capital, either from the central bank through a special window, or from the treasury with some initial seed capital and some set of guarantees which will allow you to mobilize the money to put out capital of a kind which was required for social and economic development, but which actually the market itself would not provide. So you needed to close this gap. And that's why you don't need development banks in centrally planned economies, because everything takes place through the budget. You need development banks in market economies. And that's why we all created, development banks, and many of us shut them down. As you said, we created commercial banks and reverse merged them with them. So I think we understand Sri Lanka is now, and the new government is contemplating going back to an era where you have one or more development banks. And that's, I think, an absolutely correct recognition. And it's not only Sri Lanka. I mean, India had a very complex development banking infrastructure. They destroyed it in large measure, excepting for 1 or 2 institutions. But now, 2 budgets back, the government decides, like they're thinking of here, to create a new development bank. So it's unfortunate that we sacrificed what we had rather than build on it. But I think it's better to recognize that you need these specialized institutions if you want a financial structure which serves as a development instrumentality and not merely as an intermediation device.
So it's back to the drawing board in many ways, and it's very interesting to go back and do some research on history, Bandung Conference, NAM, and so on, and we see how, in a way, history repeats itself, and the situation of independent countries and colonialism, and all that. So I'm afraid we are out of time. It's been a most engrossing conversation,
Yes,
and I wish we had more time, gentlemen. But thank you very much to Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar and Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla for being with us and giving some of your knowledge to our viewers. And thank you very much to our viewers for watching. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.
Before the ultimate test, join us for a day with the legends.
Will be crowned